This might be a little less structured than a lot of the long form videos I've done on here so far. That's not the way I mean to go on. I love unhinged video essays, but it's absolutely not my style. Um, that's because this topic is the thing that started the spiral into obsession that's became this educational project, and I can get a bit heated about it. It's also because I spend a lot of time trying to compose myself and make rational arguments to people who clearly just hate children and haven't unpacked this, and that's really frustrating. So when I talk about it, I get a little het up. So you're welcome. So, for a bit of context, I'm older Gen Z. I was born in 2001, and unlike what amnesiac news reporters would have you believe, I wasn't an iPad kid because they weren't invented till I was 8. At that point, they were so expensive that if you could afford one, it was like one per household. My earliest memories of social media are watching my older cousins update their MySpace page and by the computer wondering what the fuck this fantastical thing was. When Facebook started becoming big, I listened in fascination while being told the latest fallout that had been had with distant relatives, often over politics and who disagreed with who. This is actually how I learned what abortion is. Point being, my experience of social media is quite different than what most people seem to think it would be, given that I'm Gen Z. When I was 12, people were starting to get iPhones and get on Instagram, but my mum's a social worker, so I had a fat chance getting on Instagram. I wasn't even allowed on YouTube. I had to get updates on my favourite vloggers every Wednesday at my friend's house because her parents didn't monitor her internet use. When I was 16, I decided I was old enough to make my own decisions, so I made an Instagram and a Tumblr account. By this point, quite a few of my friends had already started diets, Victoria's Secret workouts, and turned up in oddly shaped sunglasses claiming that it was so Tumblr. So I had a bit of an idea of what I was in for. But there's a couple things I didn't know at the time. Every day there'd be a new kerfuffle on social media, there'd be some new feature that everyone was using, or some mysterious new social norm associated with the most popular platform of the day. My friend's diets started to get worse. I started to get a sense for what my mum was so reluctant about. All these things fascinated my teenage brain and took up more of my mental energy than I enjoyed. What got to me most was an overwhelming feeling of opaqueness. What the fuck was this platform? How did it work? Why did it cause people to go on weird diets, fall for conspiracy theories? Creating an environment that supported positive social media use for everyone felt insurmountable and it felt completely beyond my control. I'm sure that's a feeling that a lot of people are familiar with. Eventually, I went on to study interaction design, and in my first year, I took my first human computer interaction class. Whilst I was doing some extra reading for this class, I came across the concept of habit forming products in the hook cycle. This helped me to understand my own experiences of social media, and it explained how my friends and I were drawn into it, and why people's behavior in social media often made little to no sense. At this time, I was 19, and my 13-year-old brother was just starting to explore social media, so I watched him closely. I noticed how he interacted with his devices and began to compare those reactions to the concept I'd learned about. I started to get really frustrated as I watched my parents struggle to understand his behavior and noticed him sometimes behaving in uncharacteristic ways. The explanations for this were right there in my textbooks, but all I could see around me from real adults was aggression, blame, and an indomitable belief in the willpower of their adolescent. I knew that the way my brother was reacting could be perfectly explained and that it wasn't his fault, but no one else seemed to understand this and would often act as if these reactions were some kind of character flaw. This also helped me understand why aggressive restrictions always got on my nerves as a young teenager. I understood that my anger was twofold. Firstly, at the companies designing these persuasive interfaces, not explaining how it impacts people before letting children on it. Secondly, at the grown ups that acted as if this was a personal failing of mine or my friends or my brothers. As I grew into an adult over the course of my time at university, this frustration only increased. There were designers out there who were consciously choosing to create these persuasive designs, and millions of people who would rather shout abuse at teenagers than actually deal with the problem. This frustration became the foundation of my honours project that I did in my final year of university. This project explored the effectiveness of a digitally enabled teacher led program on social media design aimed at fostering what I call social media literacy, although I'm currently workshopping slightly different terms for this that encompass the element of the digital divide. And the idea is that this empowers teens to take control over their social media experiences. If you watch to the end and you understand all of this, please let me know what terms you think encompass this better, because I'm slightly struggling to figure that one out. A big reason for the negative experiences of social media, and by teens and adults alike, is a lack of autonomy. What's often going on here is a lack of autonomy. There's evidence to back this up. Studies suggest that teens generally don't feel in control of their social media experience. And it makes sense. Do you feel in control of how you experience social media? When you think of a teenager in your life, or you think of your experience as a teenager, do you think the way that they or you react to their devices makes sense? Are they acting like themselves? Or are these reactions out of character, like I said earlier? This lack of autonomy isn't a mystery or a hidden agenda. Most interfaces are specifically designed to strip away autonomy. The way designers create the like button and the layout of interface screens on short form video interfaces are designed to trigger specific behavioral reactions. It's no surprise that this means we don't feel in control of those reactions. And how do you give people back control over their digital experiences? Through education. To regain control over something, you need to understand how it works. The evidence on restrictive approaches is really mixed. Some studies show that complete restriction can even harm teenagers' mental health. My hypothesis is that this is because when teenagers feel like they lack control online, taking away their choices about their digital experience might actually be worsening how they're feeling about their digital devices. And anecdotally, this makes sense because when a teenager decides to go off social media of their own volition, you often find people reporting positive things. But when that's attempted to be influenced by an adult, then those reports are often negative. But the vast majority of teenagers aren't going to decide to go off social media, nor do I think they should. That might work for 1 in 10 kids who's more introverted, who's able to make friends anyway, who doesn't really feel the need to participate in the latest trends. But that's not most teenagers, because that's not how teenagers' brains generally work. As a designer and as a shouty Gen Z, I'll always be an advocate for long term change, better digital spaces, redefinition of dark patterns to include any kind of persuasive design, and boatloads of regulation to make sure the next generation is set up for success. But a level of literacy is required for young people, especially, to be able to say, we don't like how this interface is designed, we think it's bad for us, and we think that you should do it this way instead, and we want the government to have a say in that. But if social media and the science that governs its carefully crafted interfaces remains a mystery, no one is ever going to be able to advocate for this. Something else I've noticed anecdotally is that the reason the direct impact of social media on mental health can be hard to pin down is because these impacts are highly individualized. In my interviews with various head teachers, something that comes up a lot is that social media has really different impacts person to person. This is just my own theorizing, but it seems to be acting as an amplification tool for negative coping mechanisms in teens. For example, if your teenager is more likely to self isolate when something goes wrong, social media enables this. If they're more likely to lash out, same story. This could also be causing a knock on effect in social dynamics, something that isn't highly studied. The good news is, online habits start offline. We all know how expensive extracurricular activities are getting, so it's no surprise that teenagers who don't have access to these resources to pay for these activities spend more time on their phones, up to an average of 2 hours a day. This doesn't. Whilst this is quite disheartening in terms of the impact on lower income kids, it does display that when teenagers have access to activities that are more interesting than their devices, they do choose those activities. And improving access to extracurriculars, lowering the cost of entry, and improving the variety that are available can go some way towards mitigating this problem. I'm aware that a lot of leftists critique this idea after there was a speech by some footballer after Adolescent came out, and a lot of feminists in particular criticized that speech. I understand where you're coming from there, but the data says otherwise. The data suggests that improving access to the amount of extracurriculars and improving access to them makes a big difference, and that the digital divide is the main driver of this. And also, another interesting example of the nuances here is the research into online gaming, proving that there's a lot of social benefits when the games are age appropriate, that is, obviously. Another thing that's important to note when you're looking at the nuances of the impact of social media on mental health or on society more broadly is that our brains really struggle to accurately estimate the amount of time we spend on our devices. Lots of people hugely overestimate the time they spend on their screens, and lots of people underestimate it also. Something I've been guilty of before I understood this is hyper focusing on one or two instances where I've used my phone in an unhealthy manner and creating a narrative in my head that I have a terrible relationship with my phone. I think a lot of us are guilty of this, and I think this particularly applies to parents. My dad is very guilty of this. He'll see my brother go on his phone once in a family gathering, and then we'll give him a lecture in the ride home when he literally was on his phone for 2 minutes. Like, so you might be misinterpreting your own relationship and your own time on your devices. But you might also be projecting this onto your children. Family dynamics aside, and there are plenty of those for everybody, this is a simple cognitive bias. Negativity bias is the tendency to focus more on negative aspects, even when there's positive and neutral factors equally present. I would also say framing a discussion around potential excessive or inappropriate phone use, around is this good for, don't go on your phone in front of granddad, that's rude. The reason this doesn't go down well with teenagers or your children in their early 20s, it's because it creates a subconscious belief that you care more about their manners than their well-being, and nobody wants to hear that from someone they love. It's also excessively irritating when an adult who frequently checks their phone all at inappropriate times tells you not to do the same thing, so you might need to rein in and check your own behavior. Insofar as my educational program goes, I worked with teachers to co-create different solutions. A frustration that came up a lot was rooted in the myth of the digital native. Teenagers might use platforms like experts, but knowing how to swipe or post is not the same as knowing what these actions do to your attention, mood, or sense of self. And there's no correlation between being on devices from a young age and having a greater understanding of this. The digital native idea was debunked pretty soon after it was coined, but it stuck in the public imagination anyway, because these easy narratives do tend to do that. But explaining this to teenagers can obviously prove challenging. This is why I advocate for an educational approach that does it differently. This approach doesn't tell them what to do, but it teaches them what they don't know about social media platforms, explaining their lack of autonomy without saying it explicitly. It's not about judging their behavior, but it's about explaining it to them. The onboarding process involves an introductory quiz about people's social media habits, examining screen time, who they follow, and how their family uses their platforms. This is to open the door to deeper discussions, not to track this data. It's purely for personal reflection. The first classroom activity asks students to analyse social media design, exploring key features and showing them how these design choices grab attention and linking these features to how they impact their brain and habits. Next, they address real world problems faced by social media companies, brainstorming solutions in groups to help them examine corporate motivations. This helps them grasp the larger socio-economic context of the platforms, challenging them to shift from passively using social media platforms to think about its design and the purpose of that design. If you ask them to explore this design problem and come up with a solution, and then you show them that the social media company comes up with a Disney villain-esque solution, it shows them very clearly that these companies don't have their best interests at heart without lecturing them on it, because that doesn't work. Program ends with a study of the filter bubble effect, where students take a quiz to assess their online experiences and then view a social media feed that doesn't match their interests. Confronting these differences is meant to encourage them to gain insight into their online environments, again, without giving them a lecture or directly confronting the issue. Evidence suggests that when teenagers are given space to reflect on their digital habits, patterns can shift, not because they're told to change, but because they begin to notice what's shaping them. The goal with this is to let young people experiment and find out how much social media use versus other hobbies balance is good for them, and to be able to advocate for a better future. Some research suggests a Goldilocks zone of around 2 hours on weekdays and around 5 hours on weekends, but screen time is a hugely variable and widely debated metric, so this is only a guide. Everyone will differ, but we can all find our own Goldilocks zone. And if we can help the teenagers in our lives find their Goldilocks zone too. If you're a parent, you might have an instinct for what that zone is for your teenager and what other interests might help balance this. But experimentation is the only way for people to actually discover this. That way, you're not relying on willpower, which, let's be honest, is tricky for most of us, never mind teenagers. Something that most young people are quite aware of is the way that older generations treat us when they talk about our digital habits, as if we're zoo animals almost. Well, and I say this to point out that this is a very right wing approach to children. This is something I've understood quite instinctively my whole life because that approach wasn't the approach that my mum took and it wasn't the approach that my gran takes either. Um, but in order to explain this in the context of my work, I wanted to explore it in a bit more depth. So this essay is called Does Neoliberalism Hate Kids? And it argues that neoliberalism is obsessed with productivity, self-sufficiency, and the idea that everyone should be a rational, independent economic actor. Children, by definition, don't fit that mold. They're dependent, they need care, they're not useful. So the system ignores them or tries to force them into boxes. That's why you see things like underfunded schools, endless standardized testing, and adults panicking about screen time or lazy youth instead of actually listening to what young people are saying about their lives. It's easier for neoliberalism to blame kids for not measuring up rather than to admit that the system is failing. And the result is a culture where young people are treated as problems to be managed or future workers to be shaped, not as people with rights and needs. This second work is called The Terrifying Abyss of Insignificance, Marginalization, Mattering, and Violence. When you're constantly told you don't matter by schools, by policy, the way adults talk about kids these days, it does something to you. This feeling of insignificance isn't just sad, it's dangerous because this marginalization creates an abyss where you start to believe that you're invisible or that you're a problem. That's why a lot of young people lash out, withdraw, and sometimes it's why they engage in toxic online cultures. It's a way to feel something and feel seen. Social media can make this worse or better depending on whether you find community or just more reasons to feel like you don't belong. The real violence isn't what happens online or in the news, it's the slow violence of being ignored, dismissed, or blamed. Now, I don't entirely agree with this essay completely. I think it overblows and takes away blame. If you're going to treat teenagers like people, they also have to take a certain amount of accountability. And I think this slightly misses the mark on that. But I'm just saying this to highlight that there is a lot of work in the left wing spaces that argues that the approaches are not helpful. I also want to talk about Australia's social media ban for young people. It's supposed to be about protecting kids, but it's actually a massive overreach that ignores the rights of young people. International law, like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, says that children have the right to participate, to access information, and to express themselves. Blanket bans don't protect those rights. And the young people and as we've already touched on, the young people who are affected the most are those who have the least low income kids, marginalized community, or anyone that relies on digital spaces for connection or support. Bans like this don't make kids safer. If you actually care about young people, you invest in digital literacy, you listen to what they say about their experiences, and you make platforms safer, not just more lockdown. I also, yes, I'm going to talk about Jonathan Haidt. I'm sorry. I don't want to talk about Jonathan Haidt either. If you want to skip this section, please feel fucking free. It's worth noting Jonathan Haidt is a transphobe and like not left wing. He's like center right. I think he calls himself a centrist, but I would put him center right in like any political spectrum that's not US centered. And also not an expert on internet studies at all. Doesn't know what he's talking about. I think he was like a sociologist or something, and that doesn't, by virtue of that expertise, does not translate to understanding the impact of social media on teens. There's a lot of people who actually study this and have degrees in it, including doctorates. So I don't like the man. I'm trying to compose myself. So let's get into it. The anxious generation claims smartphones and social media are the root cause of this youth mental health crisis, despite all evidence to the contrary. And by all evidence, I do mean all fucking evidence. By evidence, I mean peer-reviewed research, not books written by idiots who are unqualified. I might cut that bit out. I'm trying to talk about Scamley, but this is the part that I was talking about in the intro where I started getting really fucking annoyed. I don't like this man. Okay. He leans really heavily on correlation as causation. He cherry-picks studies that fit his narratives and ignores a huge body of evidence suggesting that the impact of digital tech is mixed, context-dependent, and often positive for marginalized or isolated teens. He glosses over research showing that social media can be a lifeline for vulnerable youth, and most large-scale reviews only find small or inconsistent links between screen time and mental health. Like I've talked about, my view is not because there's no impact, it's because it's highly individualized. And I think there's an ongoing kind of vaguely left-wing narrative that the data suggests that there's no influence. I don't think that's accurate. I think anybody who has eyes can see that that's not accurate. I think it's highly individualized. And I think the digital divide is our more pressing concern. Just to make my stance clear. His alarmism fits really perfectly with neoliberalism's tendency to blame children for systemic failures. It frames young people as fragile, defective, in need of stricter control, rather than asking why we live in a society that refuses to provide children with support, autonomy, or a voice. Instead of addressing inequality, lack of offline opportunities, or the broader context of youth marginalization, his solutions double down on surveillance and restriction, reinforcing a very adult-centric punitive system that neoliberalism thrives on. It's also worth noting that the central statistics he uses, it's purely US-based, the data, that is. And that's important, not for cultural difference. I'm going to be angry in Scottish reasons. It's important because the year that you see the spike was when Obamacare was introduced and more people were able to access mental health care. Call me crazy. I think that might have something to do with it. But suddenly you have millions of people across this data set who are now all of a sudden able to access mental health care. Yeah, you're going to see a fucking rise in mental health issues. And it's also a very like privileged perspective. Like, yeah, people actually were and are just miserable if they don't have access to mental health care. And a lot of people are very fucking good at hiding it. And your anecdotal experience of being upper middle class, I don't actually know what his background is. That's me making a huge assumption, or just stupid, and don't notice the people around you, doesn't mean that you're right about that, because people are just very good at hiding it, their mental health issues. So that's a more of a personal perspective, something that I experience a lot in my life. I've had design jobs pretty consistently throughout university, and I graduated a couple of years ago, but basically because of that, I never really had to have a minimum wage job, which has helped my neurodivergence to thrive a lot. And I often get hit with the, well, what would you do if you didn't have that, or words to that effect. And it's like, yeah, be miserable. I would be miserable. People are miserable. I don't want to be miserable. People are frequently miserable. Neurodivergent people who are forced to work, particularly autistic folks, who are forced to work customer facing retail or hospitality jobs, are fucking miserable. They're good at hiding it, but they're miserable. And I think a lot of people who maybe don't struggle with their mental health don't understand that lots of people do, and they just get on with it, and that's shit, and we should fix it. And that's something I get a lot. That's just my personal experience of that attitude. And I think there's a lot of that creeping into Hyde's analysis, or into a lot of analysis that can get quite overly simplistic. So to return to my original point, now that I've gotten that out of my system, educational programs are key to building an alternative digital future. This isn't just because of individual mental health outcomes, but it's also because of the state of the world. Most of us don't have any say in the platforms that govern so much of our daily lives. They hold a mysterious quality and create frameworks of understanding the digital that limit our future options. And these educational solutions are the beginning of demanding regulation, the beginning of accountability, and the beginning of a better digital future. We have to think beyond solutions that involve restriction and punishment towards solutions that treat teenagers and young adults with dignity and respect. Thank you. If you're mean in the comments, I'll block you. Just if you've made it this far, I feel like telling you that.